Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. Today what I want to do is walk you through step by step how you might build an investment portfolio to last a lifetime. Now I know I'm making a big promise. How can we actually build an investment portfolio that we would be comfortable holding for a lifetime? Well, I'm going to at least show you how I would do it. And what we're going to do, we're going to walk through, I'm going to use Vanguard funds in this video. You don't need to use Vanguard funds. I'm not recommending these. There are other great funds out there. If I had to pick someone, I just picked Vanguard. I own some of these funds, many of them I don't. But what I want to do is walk through how you can build this lifetime portfolio and how to think through some of the choices that you'll have to make. Because remember, there's no one single right way to do this. We have choices. One of the big choices we have is how many funds do we want to own? We can actually do this in just one fund. I'll show you that. We could do it in 6 funds, maybe even more, and still have what I would think of as a reasonable portfolio. How do we make that decision? We're going to cover it. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to first show you what I would call the core of the portfolio. These, for me, are non-negotiable. Now that's for me. You may disagree, and that's fine, but to me, these are non-negotiable. And then we're going to talk about building that non-negotiable portfolio using a different number of funds, and why might you pick one and why might you use 3? What are the pros and cons? And then I'll talk about other types of funds you might, if you want to, add on to this, again, core portfolio. So that's what we're going to do. So let's get started. And the core portfolio for me, and again, just for clarity, I'm not a financial advisor. I'm not an investment advisor. I've been investing for, 35 years, I think. And this is sort of how I do it. This core portfolio should, in my view, for the most part, there are some exceptions, but for the most part, should cover the whole market. That's my view. That means stocks and bonds. It means U.S. stocks. And for me, I know it's somewhat controversial since U.S. stocks have done so well compared to foreign stocks, but for me, it also includes foreign or international stocks. And for me, it, of course, includes bonds. Now, how much go in stocks and how much go in bonds, that can change depending on how long you have before you retire and those sorts of questions. Many of you might have the vast majority just in stocks with maybe a small amount in bonds. For those, my age and older, maybe you have more in bonds. Whatever portfolio we look at today, you can make those adjustments to meet your needs. So let's start with a single fund portfolio that would qualify for this. Again, I'm going to call it the non-negotiable core of a portfolio. And there are basically 2 options for the most part. One would be a target date retirement fund. And I'll show you an example of this. This is Vanguard's 2060 fund. Now, in target date retirement funds, they always have a year. And the idea is you can use the year to pick your fund. So if you think you're going to retire, they actually give it here, 2056 to 2060. If you're going to retire then this fund might be for you. The thing I would say is there's no requirement that you actually use the fund that matches when you think you're going to retire, right? You could pick whatever fund you want. It's not like they're going to ask you when you're going to retire, and if you said 2040, prevent you from investing in this fund. And that's important because these target date funds include everything we need to build a core non-negotiable portfolio. But the asset allocation will change depending on which specific target date fund you choose. And it'll also change over time as you get closer and closer, in this case, to 2060. Now, so what's this fund? What's it look like inside? Well, we can go to portfolio composition. By the way, you could also look this up in Morningstar using that ticker, but we're just going to stick with Vanguard for today. And here's the fund. We've got, it walks you through. They're going to put about 54.5% in their total stock market index fund. I own this fund. This is an institutional plus share. I think I own a different class, but it basically invests in all stocks in the United States. And so you can see that's just over half. So in other words, for every dollar you invest in this fund, about $54, I guess, and 50 cents would go into this fund. Then they'll put about just under $36 in the Vanguard Total International Stock Index Fund, right? And then they're going to put $6.70 out of every 100 in Vanguard Total Bond Market Fund. This is U.S. bonds. And then 3% in international. So you have great coverage of everything. Wonderful core portfolio. I think this could easily work as your non-negotiable core portfolio. Again, I'm not recommending this for you. That's going to depend on a lot of factors. This is just an example. And it's very inexpensive. It's 8 basis points, I believe. Yep, right here. So, I mean, it's effectively free. I mean, it is 8 basis points, but I mean, that's, it's really, really inexpensive. And so that's a perfect example. A single fund, you've got what, again, your non-negotiable core. Now, as I mentioned, this is a target date retirement fund, so the asset allocation will change as you get older and we get closer and closer, in the case of the fund I showed you, to 2060. And that may be just what you want. Some folks say, I'd love to have this kind of fund where the asset allocation doesn't change. Well, Vanguard's got you covered. We can go to what they call their LifeStrategy funds. Again, they have like 4 of them. This particular one is the moderate growth, and again, the difference is the asset allocation. In fact, let me back up. Here are the 4 funds, and the most conservative has 20% stocks and 80% bonds. And then the most aggressive is 80% stocks and 20% bonds. Now you can see there is a limitation here, because if you said, Rob, I'm just dying for a 50-50 portfolio, well, you couldn't do that, at least with Vanguard's funds. Again, other companies offer these types of funds. They're generally referred to as asset allocation funds. That's sort of the generic term for these funds. But we'll go back to the moderate growth. This is 60-40 is just an example. A tad more expensive, but still 13 basis points. That's just 0.13%, of 1%, very inexpensive. And it basically holds the same funds, I believe, that we just looked at. Yeah, pretty much. We've got the total market. We've got international here. We've got bonds, U.S. bonds and international bonds. Of course, they're in different percentages for this fund because they want to get a 60-40 portfolio, and that's what you get. And there you go. Those are 2 examples of our non-negotiable core in a single fund, either a LifeStrategy or asset allocation fund or a target date retirement fund. Now, some will say there's some limitations to these types of funds, and there could be good reason to say, well, I'd like to actually break it in 2 and have all my stocks in one fund, but my bonds in a separate fund. Let me show you what that would look like, and we'll talk about why you might want to do that. Again, these are just examples. These are not recommendations for you. But we could use VT, and again, I'm sticking with Vanguard funds, but there are other companies that do this similar thing. VT invests in, you can see it, invests in just under 10,000 stocks around the globe. So in this fund, you get U.S. and international. It's roughly, you can see here, the foreign holdings are 36.8, we'll call it 37%. And for the most part, the rest is in U.S. stocks. They do hold usually 1% or so in cash. But that's the split. So this is all stocks, one fund, you're done. And it's very inexpensive. Let's see, go back to the top here, 7 basis points, really cheap. And then for bonds, we could use, as an example, not the only good option, but B&D. That's a total bond market fund. Now, this would not give us international bonds. I'm personally okay with that. It's a very diverse bond fund. It's got U.S. government bonds, corporate bonds, some mortgage-backed securities. It's just 3 basis points. Very, very inexpensive. So you've got our non-negotiable core and 2 funds. Now, why would we want to do that as opposed to just using the LifeStrategy or target date retirement fund? Well, there's at least two reasons. One is when you break the stocks and the bonds into 2 funds, you then get to determine what percentage you put in each. Because you may say, Rob, I'm just dying to put 13.5% in a bond fund. Well, great, you can do that. You can't do that with a LifeStrategy fund. You probably can't do that with a target date retirement fund. If you could, it would change over time. So if you really want to get precise on your bond allocation and your stock allocation, well, break it into 2 funds. You could do that. There's a second reason, is that you may want to keep your bonds, for example, out of your taxable account because they produce taxable interest every year. And you may say, I'd rather have those in my traditional IRA or maybe a traditional 401k. And I can't do that with just one fund because those one fund solutions include stocks and bonds. So by separating out my stocks in one fund and my bonds in another, I can have some control over the tax implications of where I hold these different funds. So there you go, 2 fund, non-negotiable core portfolio. Now, let's look at a 3 fund. And we could do that. We could keep this bond fund for our bonds. And with a 3 fund, what we could do is we could break apart the U.S. stocks from the international stocks. Remember, in VT, it's all one fund. It's 37%. It's going to drop down here, 37% roughly. In foreign, you can't control that, right? You can't call up Vanguard and say, I want to buy VT, but can you only have 25% in foreign holdings? Yeah, it doesn't work that way. So to do that, we've got to break apart the U.S. stocks and the international, no worries. We got BND for our bonds, VTI for our stocks. This is just a total U.S. stock market fund, very inexpensive, 3 basis points. You could say 3 bips if you want to impress your friends at a party, or just look odd, either way. And for international, VXUS is just, again, one example. It's a fund that I own. I own both. I actually own all 3 of these funds, but that doesn't mean you should. But VXUS, one example, 8 basis points, very inexpensive. And these are very diverse. You think, well, 3 funds, that's not very diverse, is it? Oh my goodness, look at this. This one fund owns over 8,500 companies, just one fund. VTI, not as many, I'll say 30 or 3,000 in some. Yep, 3,600. And the bond fund owns probably over 10,000 bonds. Yeah, 11,000. So this is a very diverse portfolio. Don't think that it's just 3 funds. How diverse can it be? The number of funds don't tell you anything about diversity. Now, again, why would we want to do this? Well, you may say, Rob, I want to have I don't want to have 36.8% in international. I want more than that, or I want less than that. Well, okay, you got to have an international fund and a U.S. fund, and this 3-fund portfolio does that. So here are sort of 3 ways to build the non-negotiable core, and the reasons why. You might opt for simplicity and just say, I'm just going to stick with the target date retirement fund as an example, or you can make it by no means complicated, but add a fund or 2 so that you have some control over the tax consequences and a little bit of control over the asset allocation, for example, between international stocks and U.S. stocks. There you go. Now, once we get beyond the non-negotiable core, there are, I think, reasonable approaches where you might start to add even more funds. And I don't think it's necessary. I would be very comfortable with this portfolio. I would say for the most part, I have added some extra funds, not a lot. But it's really, honestly, it comes down to preference. It really does, because there's no way to know ahead of time which asset allocation and which combination of funds are going to produce the best results. Just not. So you just have to come up with a different reason for your choices. And but I think these are all reasonable. So let's kind of walk through some examples. But first, there are tips. We could say, I like BND or a total bond fund, but there's no inflation protection on these kinds of funds. And so with tips, I get some inflation protection. Again, this is just one example, but this would be an example of a inflation protected bond, ETF, or it's a mutual fund, VIPSX, it's a mutual fund. I guess we'll go to the Admiral shares. Maybe it shows a cheaper price. Yeah, this is what you would invest in anyway, VAIPX. It's just 10 basis points. And so, for a long time, I've had about half my bonds in tips, half my bonds in like a BND. Again, not recommending that for you, but that would be one approach if you said, I want some inflation protection. I've actually thought recently I might move away from this just to simplify my portfolio, but I think exposure to tips, very, very reasonable. All right, what else could we do? Well, a lot of folks say, I want some more exposure to real estate through REITs. Now remember, all of these funds we've looked at have REITs. These have REITs, VT has REITs, VTI has REITs. I'm going to assume even VXUS, so that's international. But all of these portfolios that we were creating include REITs, but they don't include all that much. I would say VTI, my recollection is it's around 3% exposure to real estate. That could be off a little bit, so you want to double check that. But a lot of folks say, I really want 5% allocated or 10%. And so they'll add another fund. This is just an example. I don't own this fund now. I have in the past. I actually owned in the past the mutual fund version, which is right here, VGSLX. It's a great way to get exposure to real estate, just 13 basis points. So a lot of folks will say, okay, I want to add a REIT fund. There you go. Some would say, and I did this for a while, I don't anymore. I want to add some emerging market, very, very volatile, but can add over time, can add some diversity. And now again, I want to stress, like a target date retirement fund, it's going to have exposure to emerging markets. LifeStrategy fund, it's going to have exposure through the International Stock Fund. VXUS has exposure to emerging markets. So again, I want to stress this, with our non-negotiable core, we don't have access to tips. We don't with that, but we do have exposure to REITs. We do have exposure to emerging markets, but some folks would say, I want even more. So for a while, I put 10% in emerging markets. I did that for a couple of decades. I don't now. Again, I just wanted a more simplified portfolio, but I mentioned this as an example of how you might sort of move the asset allocation a little bit towards some of these asset classes if you want to. The last one I'll mention is small cap value. Again, I've got small cap exposure. This is one I still have, not this particular fund. I think I have this fund in a small amount. I have a different fund for small cap. But this is, again, just an example. Historically, small cap value has been one of the best asset classes. However, not so in recent times. Last 10 to 20 years, it's not done nearly as well. Whether it'll do well going forward, your guess is as good as mine. But it's an example where at one point I put about 10% in small cap value. Today I have about 10%. It's more of small cap blend. Again, but the thing I want to stress there is there's no right answer. Right? You have to make a choice. For the longest time I had small cap value, 10%. I had 10% in emerging markets. I had 10% in REITs. And then I had my non-negotiable core portfolio. That was my sort of 6-fund portfolio that I've talked about in the past. I'm very comfortable not having that today because the vast majority of my portfolio makes up the non-negotiable core. And then I have a few other things like small cap, and I have 2 individual stocks, Berkshire and Apple. But the core of my portfolio is that non-negotiable core made up of, in my case, 4 funds. I have added tips recently. But there you go. Kind of a walkthrough of how to think, at least how I think about building a portfolio. The key, the most important thing for me, that non-negotiable core and how you get it. Again, 1 fund, 2 fund, or 3 funds, or maybe 4 if you want to put tips in. One could argue that should be part of a non-negotiable core. I don't feel too strongly about that. And then if you want to, you could add some other types of asset classes in relatively small amounts. At least that's how I think through building an investment portfolio that could last a lifetime. So there you go. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. I'll be happy to help you out any way I can. Until next time, remember, the best thing money can buy is financial freedom.